Welcome back to Pakistan This Week and our exclusive interview of Noam Chomsky conducted by Pervez Hoodbhoy. Let's carry on to part 2 of the discussion, where the gentlemen explore the shape of the world in the future, the relationship between the Muslim world and the West, and human nature as it relates to international relations.
Professor Chomsky, if I may, let's turn to a different aspect of US policy and what it is likely to become in the years ahead. It is in strong competition today with China. China is the emerging superpower, at least in economic terms, if not militarily, although militarily too, it's now building up quite a bit. Let's assume for the moment that China was to take the place of the United States as being the most powerful nation on earth in terms of its corporations, its companies being all over the world, the yuan being the world currency instead of the dollar, policing being done by Chinese forces rather than US forces. What would be the shape of that world? Would it be a better world, do you think, than that dominated by the United States?
I don't think it would, but the possibility is so remote, it's hardly worth talking about. Let's take a careful, there's a lot of inflated talk about this, but let's take a look at the facts. Take a look at the Human Development Index, UN Human Development Index. China is approximately 90th. India, the other great power, is about 120th. These are very poor countries. GDP per capita in China, according to the World Bank, is maybe 10% of the US. That's probably actually higher, maybe 20%. They have enormous internal problems. China has extreme inequality. There are tens of thousands of labor struggles every year, even according to official statistics. China is, at the moment, primarily an assembly plant. You take a look at the trade deficit of the United States with China that everyone talks about. There's a big trade deficit.
Okay, but if you were to look at statistics put out by, let's say, Goldman Sachs, they make predictions of where China's GDP will be, where India's will be, and where the United States will be. And there's going to be a crossover point, I think, in 2025, unless I'm mistaken. So the GDP of the Chinese is going to exceed that of the United States.
The relevant question is GDP per capita. You know, GDP in itself doesn't mean much. Furthermore, if you take a look at it, right now, it'll change over time. But for the moment, Chinese production is mostly foreign-based.
Agreeing with what you said, nevertheless, if you take China and India together, they are definitely producing, they will be producing much more wealth than the United States.
No.
They will
because the wealth
also be major players in determining the politics of the countries around them. Then there's Europe, which is an alternate center of power. All this means is that the US will not have that preeminent position that it once had. How is this going to reflect upon the global international order? It's certainly not going to be that of the post-Cold War era.
But that, as I say again, that's a steady process since 1945. By the early 1970s, the world was already tripolar economically. That was the term that was used. There's a North American area, there's a German-based European area. There was, at that time, a Japan-based Asian area. Now it's Japan, China-based Asian area. And it's been expanding, and now the world is even more diverse. The leading problem, and what's going to lead to the decline of the United States, in my opinion, is not so much the rise of China and India, which is, it's there, but I don't think it's that significant. It's internal. The United States internally is becoming a kind of a third world power.
It was once the source of all technology, or most innovative technology. It had, well, a population that was very well educated, informed.
The 1950s and the 1960s were the biggest growth period in American history. In fact, that's where a lot of the technology comes from. In fact, it comes from right where we're sitting.
Okay, so we see the decline of the US because its internal economy is no longer able to sustain that kind of growth which is essential for it to be the dominant world power. Today we see the United States mired down in conflicts across the globe, but particularly in Afghanistan. What is your prescription for the solution of Afghanistan? Is it instant American withdrawal?
No, I think what has to be done is U.S. planners and the military understand that they're not going to win a military victory. They don't want to withdraw with something that looks like a defeat. So they have to find some palatable way to pull out. Now that has to be a regional settlement. First of all, it has to be a regional settlement externally, but internally there has to be some kind of negotiations among Afghans and the Taliban, whether we like it or not, are Afghans.
Professor Chomsky, there's been an enormous deterioration in the relations between Muslims and the West. We've seen this after 1979, where there were two events. One was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then the US and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia get together to launch the great global jihad, and then the consequences that follow from that. And 1979 is also the Iranian Revolution. What do you think is the direction of relations between Muslims considered as a whole and the United States and Europe?
There certainly have been changes, but I think the continuities are more striking. I mentioned it before. Long before this, in 1950s, the U.S., British, French policy was that as long as our favored dictators control the population, we don't care what they think. There can be a campaign of hatred, and we don't care. We'll rely on the dictators. That is exactly the position held today, not just by governments, but even by the general intellectual culture.
Professor Chomsky, there's a lot to be discussed, and I'd like to pick your brains for hours, but we have to move towards the end. I want to ask you, what are the principles that should govern the relations between nations? Is it, well, you've been very critical of the United States, and justly so in many cases, but after all, it's not just the US which has been nasty to the world and to peoples around. It's also been practically every other country. There are countries which have performed genocide upon other populations. Is this the beast within man? Is it our inability as human beings to live together? What is it that makes us so incapable of living together in peace?
Well, I don't think we're so incapable of living together in peace. In fact, there's a lot of progress too. Take, say, Europe. For centuries, Europe was the most brutal and savage place in the world. French and Germans had no higher goal than to slaughter one another. It was a violent place, Europe, for centuries, while state formation was taking place. In fact, that's how Europe developed the culture and technology of savagery that enabled it to conquer the world. Well, that changed.
So you have an optimistic view of human nature, that somehow we can transcend the kind of propaganda that each one of us is subject to in our different environments. You've been primarily a critic of the US, and you're recognized as such across the world. But what is the message that you really want to give to peace activists, to those who want to struggle for a better society in their own respective environments? Is it to be against America, or is it to be against what?
Against power. Against power and the institutions in which power is based. So I happen to have been writing for the last 50, 60 years when the United States has been the dominant global power. Furthermore, I'm in the United States. I can, to some extent, influence actions taken in the United States. I can't influence what happens in Iran or China. So just on elementary moral grounds, of course, I focus on the United States, plus on geopolitical grounds. But if I was living in France right now, I'd be focusing on French crime, for example.
If you were living in Pakistan?
Pakistan, I'd be trying to do what you're doing. I mean, the problems of Pakistan are very severe. I don't have to, you can tell me more than I can tell you. Pakistan's a very dangerous country for reasons not unrelated to U.S. policies. As you mentioned before, the Saudi-U.S. involvement with Zia-ul-Haq kind of set off the global jihadi movement, which is no joke. But inside Pakistan, I hate that. My feeling, at least, limited information, is that there ought to be major efforts in Pakistan to try to implement something like the 1973 Constitution, which allowed for a degree of autonomy among the separate regions. Pakistan's pretty artificial, and a radical shift back in the educational system towards secularism and against religious fanaticism, and also sharp reduction, finally elimination of the nuclear system, and the crazy strategic doctrine which says that Pakistan has to match India in military force, since it can't do it in any other way, has to exceed India in nuclear power, nuclear weapons. All of this has to be radically changed. And those are problems internal to Pakistan. I can't do anything about them. You can and do.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. It was a pleasure.
And that's all from us at Pakistan This Week. Hope you enjoyed this week's exclusive interview with Noam Chomsky. We'd like to thank Mr. Chomsky for his time and Mr. Hoodbhoy for being our special correspondent for the week. If you have any comments regarding the show, we'd love to hear from you at email address ptw@cnbcpakistan.com. Join us again next week at the same time as we explore Pakistan together. And as always, keep watching CNBC.